So welcome, everybody. Welcome. Can I get your attention? I'm delighted that you could all come. We may have a few people continue to join us at the end of the workday for a presentation sponsored by RASM, meaning Together, We Are Ukraine, about the evolving crisis in Ukraine, its global implications. I'm very happy to introduce a large and very provocative and interesting panel, including Ivana Bilic, Paul Gobel, Alexander Gudko, Andreas Kalindra, Georgi Kvelashvili, and Mateusz Sena. I'm not going to take the time to go through their biographies. It's in a program that's available here in the front. You can read about their brief biographies as we go through this. So without further ado, I'm going to start by giving the floor to Ivana Bilic.
Good evening, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank you for coming today, and I would like to thank so many people who made this happen. Mary Holland, obviously, she's an inspiration and such a great mentor, and I would like to thank European American Solidarity Council for inviting some of the speakers tonight, and of course RASM. And as the crisis continues in Ukraine, obviously the human rights organization RASM sponsored a break, a very interesting report basically about the crisis in Ukraine and its legal dimensions that became also known as the white paper. I would like to remind you what happened in Ukraine just very briefly. So the report was written to assist the media, governments, and international organizations, non-governmental organizations, businesses, academia, and individuals to understand what has happened, why it has happened, and what may happen next. So what exactly happened in Ukraine? On November 21st, the former President Yanukovych announced that he abandoned a trade agreement with EU, and he decided to seek closer ties with Russia, which developed into lots of protests in Ukraine. And as public support grew for pro-EU anti-government, it became much more intense, and as the police, the riot police was trying to get rid of the protesters. On January 16, the anti-protest laws passed and quickly were condemned as draconian. More street clashes left at least 18 people dead and around 100 injured. Kiev saw its worst days of violence, and almost 88 people died in less than 48 hours. And these people became known as Heavenly 100. Later on, Ukrainian parliament signed presidential powers to its new speaker, Alexander Turchinov, as Ukrainian former president fled the country. Pro-Kremlin armed men seized government buildings in Crimea. Then armed men in unmarked combat fatigue seized Simferopol and its international airport, and also to other airports in Crimea. Russian forces fired warning shots on unarmed Ukrainian soldiers marching towards an air base in Simferopol. Then on March 15, UN Security Council members voted overwhelmingly in support of a draft resolution condemning an upcoming referendum on the future of Crimea as illegal. And Russia obviously vetoed that resolution, and China abstained. Notwithstanding the resolution, Crimea's referendum went ahead, and was condemned as illegal on domestic and international level. And on March 21st, Moscow signed a bill to formally annex the peninsula. UN General Assembly then approved the resolution declaring Russian annexation of Ukraine's Crimea illegal. And on March 29, the Ukraine's presidential race began. On April 12, pro-Russian gunmen took over the police station and security services buildings in towns in Slovyansk, it's eastern Ukraine, 60 kilometers from Donetsk, where pro-Russian rebels took over the police headquarters. The separatists also seized a police headquarters in Kramatorsk. On April 15, politicians in Moldova Transnistria region called on Moscow and the UN to recognize its independence. So we saw some other regional movements. On April 17, Putin acknowledged that Russian forces were deployed in Crimea during the March referendum on joining Russia, but said he hoped that not to use his right to send Russian troops into Ukraine. On April 21st, protesters in Luhansk pledged to hold their own local referendum on autonomy on May 11. On April 23rd, Russia said it will respond if its interests are attacked in Ukraine, and then on April 24, Ukrainian special forces seized back control of the town hall in the port city of Mariupol. And on April 29, Russia denied again it has troops in eastern Ukraine. On April 30th, Kyiv placed its armed forces on combat alert against a possible Russian invasion and admitted police were helpless to stop rebels overrunning eastern towns. On May 2nd, in the southern city of Odessa, 42 people died when clashes between pro-Russian fighters and pro-Ukrainian supporters culminated in a massive blaze. On May 11, referendums were held in the provinces of Luhansk and Donetsk. Fighting was reported in other parts of eastern Ukraine. On May 13, 7 Ukrainian soldiers were killed in rebel ambush in the deadliest single loss of life for the military since the start of the uprising. On May 25, Ukraine finally had the presidential election, and the billionaire Petro Poroshenko was elected outright in the first round as the president of Ukraine. So, where does it? So basically, just to explain what happened with Crimea and Crimean referendum, Ukraine is a unitary state, and its constitution is very clear that it's the only way to decide question of territorial integrity is by having a nationwide referendum. Ukraine is comprised of 25 regions, including Crimea, and Crimea has a very special status, as well as the city of Kyiv and city of Simferopol in Ukraine. Crimea became a part of Ukraine in 1954 when it was transferred to Ukraine by the Soviet Russian Republic as a pure administrative transition, which was very normal at the former USSR. For example, in 1924, the Taganrog was given to Russia, from Ukraine to Russia. So referendum happened in less than 10 days under the gunpoint and violated not only national laws, but also international standards of democracy and international law. So, and with that, I would like to pass to Mateusz, who will explain better on the succession.
No, it's not. Oh, it's working.
You can sit where you are, Mateusz.
No, it's working. I was just asking. Good evening to all. Thank you for Razon and NYU to this opportunity. I'd like to speak, going to speak a little bit about the situation of Crimea. As Ivana said, it's an autonomous region of Ukraine. It has a special status under Ukrainian law. And it is important to address that because as an autonomous region, it respects under the international law the self-determination principle, which addresses first a region which is a minority for a number of reasons, ethnic or religious. Have the people who live there, they have their right to be a minority respected. And if you look the recent history of Crimea, and nobody never listened to any attempt to separation, any issue there, any human rights violation, and that's important because under international law, that's the reason that justified the secession of this particular region. But as I like to, can you put the, yeah, thanks. What is important to address that? Because there is the unilateral right of secession without respecting or without having with the king state recognizing the referendum or by the decision of the parliament of the region has to be accepted by the king state. And only in the decolonization process, when you have in the 70s with the Africa, some places in Asia separating from European powers, it was accepted. Why? Because there was a foreign power occupying that region. And you don't have that in Crimea. So you can take it off the decolonization process. And as we look here in the Crimea situation, we see that it's really like the Northern Cyprus. You can see by the flags here of Crimea, you see the flag of Crimea and Russia. And the flags on Northern Cyprus, we have Turkey and Northern Cyprus flag, which look very alike. And in Northern Cyprus, it happened in the 70s. There was a political crisis on Cyprus between the Greeks and the Turks. And by the time Turkey supported the Turkish people who lived in Cyprus and support the independence. But it was just a political crisis like Ukraine. And with that, they separated. None of the countries recognized Northern Cyprus. And the most important thing that the International Court of Justice said that it's illegal for any country to recognize Northern Cyprus as a state. So that's important to the international community that cannot recognize Crimea as a part of Russia. And if any country recognizes Crimea as part of Russia, Ukraine can sue that country in the international spheres because it's a legal act. That's why it's so important to have this legal approach and say it's not like Kosovo, as Russia is saying now. Even they deny what happened in Kosovo, their independence. They still defend that it's part of Serbia. But in Kosovo, you have a pattern of 10 years of human rights violation. You have a civil war before. So it's an exception. It's not recognized by all the countries. But in Kosovo, situation is very particular because there is no way back. There's a situation that came before, and that's the case of Crimea. Crimea is pure annexation by Russia, and Russia tried by this referendum to give a legal framework to what happened, but it's purely use of force. And I would like to move to the situation now on Eastern Ukraine. As we see in the news, that they held referendums. It's not like in the situation we have in Crimea now, but we can look in the future that it can come to a frozen situation conflict where you have a situation in reality that's occupied by Russia or independent state like you have in Transnistria, and nobody recognizes. So it's a situation that's hard because nobody can take off that government, that people. And in the case of Northern Cyprus, there are more than 40 years trying to solve what they're going to do there. So it's important to see that this situation that's not going to bring any benefit to the people who live there. And it's completely illegal as well. And I'm going to talk as well about the Budapest Memorandum. That's a document that before that crisis, I think nobody really cared. Nobody know about its existence, but the Budapest Memorandum was a document signed by Russia, United States, France, China, and United Kingdom, the nuclear powers, in the beginning of the 90s when we have the collapse of Soviet Union, And by that time, Ukraine has the third largest nuclear arsenal at the world. And as a guarantee of those countries for Ukraine to give up of its nuclear weapons, they assured that Ukraine's sovereign rights and territory will be protected by them, and none of them would aggress Ukraine. Ukraine gave all its 2,000 nuclear weapons to Russia, which is kind of ironic, and Russia didn't respect, as we see now, because they annexed Crimea. It's part of the territory of Ukraine. But what's important that because it's not a treaty, how is the force of this document? Well, we think that qualifies as a unilateral declaration of Russia and the other countries. It's binding to them. The case we refer, it's the case of Australia and New Zealand against France, that France said that it's not going to make any nuclear tests in the Southern Pacific, and they decided to make, and they took that to International Court of Justice, and the International Court of Justice said that France was legally bound by its declarations to not perform nuclear tests there. So why that's important? When Ukraine signed the treaty of non-proliferation of nuclear weapons, it made a reservation. And in that reservation, it said if its territory was suffered any aggression, or better say, if the Budapest Memorandum was not respected, it was legal to Ukraine to withdraw the treaty, to denounce the treaty, and pursue the production of nuclear weapons, respecting the international law. I think it's something that Ukraine does not want, but if it happened, now Ukraine has the legal basis to do so. I hope it won't go. And now we're going to proceed to Alex, who speaks about the oil and gas situation in the region.
Good evening, everyone. For 5 minutes now, I'd like to try to give some sense to what happened with Crimea, because for me it still does not make any sense. It is part of our legal report was based on a suspicion that the annexation of Crimea was based on the energy and oil and gas reasoning. It's not a secret for everyone that Ukraine is heavily dependent on Russia in terms of its energy resources. The European Union as well imports a lot of its consumption of energy resources from Russia. Most of that is most of the oil and gas comes through the territory of Ukraine through a network of pipelines that historically crossed the territory of Ukraine. The annexation of Crimea in particular has, as we could identify, could have two reasons behind it. First of all, it's the development of offshore and onshore gas, natural gas and oil resources in Ukraine. Ukraine tried to decrease its dependence in terms of energy by increasing its domestic production. They relied on foreign investors, such transnational corporations as ExxonMobil, Shell, Chevron, names that are quite familiar to all of you. These companies entered the Ukrainian market in the past 5 years. A number of them entered into production sharing agreements with the government of Ukraine. And basically, Ukraine was trying to make another unconventional gas revolution similar to that revolution that happened in the United States. And the United States at this point has more gas than it actually can consume. That's why at this point we have talks about exports of natural gas, liquefied natural gas to Europe and potentially to Ukraine. The problem today is that there is no infrastructure for this. So we believe that the annexation of Crimea, it's not about the protection of some mysterious ethnic Russians in Crimea against some mysterious Nazis or some revolutionaries that nobody can actually have a footage of. So at this point, we have basically extreme and far-reaching disinformation that underlies this whole crisis, and even native Ukrainians who live in Ukraine start to be confused at some point. No matter which media you refer to, be it the pro-Russian media, pro-Western media, no matter how you call it, the information is distorted everywhere, and nobody just understands what actually is going on. That is why we believe that it was not about the right of self-determination for people in Crimea. As we noted when we had to present this report at the United Nations headquarters, me and a couple of other people who worked on this report lived in Ukraine for the majority of their lives and never experienced any problems with using Russian language or being ethnically Russian or of any other origin. We believe that the energy was the real reasoning behind the events that happened in Crimea. And the second point that I'd like to make is that the exports of gas from Russia to the European Union would be facilitated by a new pipeline that may cross the territory of Crimea, and it's a lot cheaper to lay this pipeline that was a year ago planned to be constructed on the seabed of the Black Sea. And on the map above, you can see that it will be a lot cheaper to use the sea shelf of Crimea to basically supply energy resources to the Crimean Peninsula, which currently is totally dependent on the mainland Ukraine. And I'd like to note that up until today, even though Ukraine has no control over the territory, as far as we know, Ukraine has not stopped to supply electricity and other energy resources to the peninsula. Basically, we think that energy and what Russia was trying to do with the annexation of Crimea is basically to destabilize the situation in Ukraine, to deteriorate the investment climate that existed. No matter all the, Ukraine could have a number of problems to deal with, but it was able to attract foreign investors with required equipment, know-how, and technology to increase its domestic production. But at this point, we see that businesses are standing by. Companies like Shell and Exxon have their businesses in the territory of Russia, and of course, they are not interested in going into politics. So at this point, they're standing by, and we are not sure what's going to happen after the presidential elections that took place last week in Ukraine. As today we are discussing global implications, I'd like to end with a couple of points that we tried to make with this report. We believe that this dispute that we have right now, the territorial dispute on Crimea, it requires a forum, a legal forum, which is nowhere to be found right now. In order to sue a sovereign state has to consent to this, because every sovereign state has sovereign immunity. And of course, there are not too many grounds to bring a claim against the Russian Federation to claim the territory of Crimea back. And at this point, the majority of states have not recognized the annexation of Crimea, and Crimea remains a territory in dispute without a clear legal status. And there are a lot of people who live in Crimea who live off summers, and my fear was that people will suffer at least this year because no tourists will come. And at this point, it's June already, and I've taken a look at a number of videos and photos available online. It is pretty bad in Crimea right now, and people's businesses will be just suspended for this summer. So this may be called a regional implication. In terms of global implications, we fear that principles of international law can be shattered, or I don't know which right word to pick. We have a situation where state borders become flexible when certain factual circumstances are artificially created to allege the right of self-determination of some people. So we here in Washington Square Park may ask the state of New Jersey to protect us against New York, and we want to just join the state of New Jersey in 10 days when we are held at gunpoint. We think that the international community has to continue responding to this threat, and not only by diplomatic means, but by creating new mechanisms that will enable the community to address such situations in future, because there are a lot of territories with similar problems or statuses as Crimea. And we may have another conflict similar to the Crimean conflict elsewhere in the world. In particular, the Security Council, the UN Security Council, has proved ineffective when one of the members of the Security Council becomes the aggressor at this point. Now we can dispute a lot whether there was a clear act of aggression on behalf of Russian Federation, but in any case, we understand that the Security Council would be able to do something and to produce the documents that would have a lot more teeth than just a declaration that we have today. And the reason the UN Security Council was not able to effectively interfere is because Russia is one of the members. So with that in mind, I probably will end, and I think our panelists today have a lot of things to share from other parts of the world.
Great. Thank you, Alex, Ivana, and Mateusz. Paul Kobel.
Three preliminary comments. First, I don't do PowerPoint. The U.S. government, of which I was part for many years, divides between military types who do PowerPoint and civilians who don't, and I continue that tradition. Second, I don't use the passive voice. One of the things that gets us in terrible trouble in this part of the world is everybody wants to talk about things that happened rather than who did what to whom. Nor do I assume that politicians are rational actors. I've seen too many examples that they are not. And I do not believe that everyone's guilty. On the one hand, on the other hand, school of analysis is simply nonsensical, and it is usually a cover for being on one side or the other. And third, I profoundly believe that the only way to understand the events in Crimea and eastern Ukraine is to look beyond those areas, because Crimea, the events in those places are not about Ukraine. They are profoundly about the international order. I live in southwestern Virginia, and I listen to country western music stations. And after Crimea was seized by the Russian government, one country western host said he had heard that just like Crimea, Russia was going to seize Transnistria, a place that he said he would describe more when he found out where it is. Americans are among the most geographically illiterate people on earth, but their biggest problem is that there is a natural inclination of foreign service officers and academics to reduce things to as small possible issues as they can, because they think that's a way of solving them. No, in fact, that's a way of making sure you don't solve things, because you don't appreciate how important they are. People are already writing off the Russian seizure of Crimea as something we just simply have to live with. That is a nonsense. Now, I'm going to do that. I'm going to go very fast. What has happened in Crimea is so important, and what's happening in eastern Ukraine is so important because it is about the nature of future wars. We are seeing a new form of aggression, which is by subversion. And we have to be very clear about this. NATO is not prepared. The defense alliances that exist are not prepared to defend against this kind of subversive activity, and we're going to see more of it if it succeeds. Second, the Crimean conflict is not about the Black Sea in the first instance, it's about the South China Sea. Because the country with the largest numbers of co-ethnics abroad is China. And if you want to see the South China Sea become a cockpit of conflict, just simply agree with the Russian position on Crimea, because it asserts that ethnicity is more important than citizenship. And third, what is happening in Crimea and what is happening in Russia, and I believe that what Mr. Putin has done in Ukraine is about domestic Russian affairs, not a rational act, but about making sure he gets support for himself, is also about guaranteeing more repression inside countries, not just in Russia. To make those linkages clear, I want to do three things very quickly with you. First, I want to argue that Vladimir Putin is challenging the three settlements of the 20th century which define the international system as it existed before the seizure of Crimea. And those are three settlements that the United States played a key role in defining, and if they are overturned, you will have a world of chaos and violence of a kind you can't even begin to imagine, because it will mean that the rules of the game go out the window. I believe Putin will fail for reasons I'll be clear about, but the point is, what he is challenging are the rules of the game. And they're not just about whether you have the border here or there in Crimea. Second, I want to make very clear to you that this is not a new Cold War. The Russians would love to have it called a new Cold War, because then they can count on liberals in the West to denounce anybody who says we should stand up to them, because they'll say it's a new Cold War. And also the Cold War, which was an ideological conflict of a kind that we do not see here, this is an imperial land grab, gives the Russians equal status, because that was what the Cold War at the end meant, an equal balance between East and West. And they would love that, which of course they do not deserve. What is coming, as the president of Estonia has properly pointed out, is something much worse than the Cold War. And we'll come back to that. And the third is, we need to be very, very clear to ourselves and to others what we cannot do. There is absolutely nothing the United States can do today to reverse the Anschluss of Crimea. There's nothing. But there are some very important things we can do in the future. Now, the three settlements that have been challenged are these. First, the settlement of 1991, the disintegration of the Soviet Union and the recognition of the recovered independence of the three Baltic states and the 12 former Soviet republics. The whole basis of international relations in Europe was about stability of borders. That was what we tried to ensure. I would like to have some comments about what was said about Ukraine having nuclear weapons. Ukraine never had nuclear weapons. There were nuclear weapons on Ukraine's territory, but we can get back to that. Challenging the idea of stability of borders opens the question of the borders everywhere. We have argued as a country that borders should not be changed. We have violated that rule, and we have been wrong to violate it. But if you raise that question, you will have all kinds of redrawing. This will give me my chance to give you my only good piece of personal advice. Do not buy maps. Buy stock in companies that print maps, because if Putin succeeds, the borders are going to change a lot, and not just around Russia. Second, what Mr. Putin has done is to challenge the settlement of 1945. The basis of the United Nations is the supremacy of citizenship over ethnicity. We fought a small war in Europe and Asia against dictators who insisted that ethnicity was more important than citizenship. The formation of the United Nations was to enshrine the principle that citizenship was primary. Vladimir Putin has asserted that being an ethnic Russian is more important than being a citizen of another country. You really want to go down that road if you've got the People's Republic of China with all of the overseas Chinese? I really don't think so. And it's a recipe for disaster. It is a recipe for disaster. The third settlement that is being challenged is a settlement of 1919, the Versailles Conference, which asserted the principle, which has been the basis of Western policy since that time, of the nation state as the ideal form of the international system, rather than empires, because it was understood by Woodrow Wilson and others that empires are by their nature repressive states and aggressive toward their neighbors to justify domestic repression. Consequently, the idea of decolonizing the world and of opposing the empire as an arrangement. But we have now we have a leader in the Kremlin who openly asserts that empire is a proper form of organization. Those are very, very scary ideas that have huge consequences. The second point I want to make is this is not a new Cold War. It is not ideological. It is not worldwide. There is not some kind of black international. There are crazy right-wing Europeans, just as there are crazy right-wingers in a lot of places, but they are not part of some kind of 15th international. Russia does not have an attractive ideology that mobilizes people everywhere, unless you believe that the call to force is a good thing. And what you've got by the call for a new, threat of new Cold War is an effort once again to disarm the West, which is only waiting as much as it can for that to occur. This is a much older and uglier kind of conflict. The means are new. They are subversive rather than the direct use of force. And make no mistake, the polite little green men in Crimea and eastern Ukraine are agents of the Russian state. They don't have to wear Russian military uniforms for us to know that. We have to be honest. And it is not true that the media in Ukraine is like Moscow television. That the media in Ukraine has defects is true. So does ours. If anyone watches Fox News should know. But let me explain to you that Moscow television has been used, like Lenin used Iskra, as an organizing and mobilizing tool to destabilizing neighboring countries. This idea that we're talking about some kind of rational act, we're talking about an atavistic, aggressive, and nativist movement that is extremely dangerous. Because if it happens there, and if someone gets away with it, the fact is it will happen elsewhere. You can talk all you like about UN rules and world courts, but if you start creating situations where people benefit by using this violation of the settlements that had organized the world of the last 25 and 30 years, and then going back even a century, what you will have is a world where you will have constant conflict, constant subversion, and the use of the kind of violence that we do not currently have a way of opposing. My third point is this. We need to be, I've testified many times before Congress, and I always sketch out disaster because that's my nature, to see bad things happening. I'm not sure why. I probably got up in the wrong side when I was 1 day old, but whatever. And the answer I've always gotten, because this is America, is, well, you've told us the problem, now tell us the solution. Americans like to believe that all problems have solutions, and increasingly Americans want those solutions available before the third commercial. Because if it doesn't happen that fast, we get bored, okay? Well, I'm here to tell you, we have no capacity to reverse Putin's Anschluss of Crimea. We have no capacity on our own to prevent the continuing subversion of eastern Ukraine. We have no capacity because we assumed the world was a different place and would be a different place. In 1991, we assumed we were at the end of history, and every country would be a liberal, democratic, free market ally of the United States and a strategic partner. In 2001, we found out there's still evil in the world, but we assumed those were all sub-state actors. Now we have been reminded that there is evil in the world, and it may be in a state actor who has enough nuclear weapons to destroy us. But if we cannot do anything to reverse what Putin has done and is doing in Ukraine immediately, and I will tell you, creating international structures to talk about it invites the kind of invasiveness inside countries that, if you think about it for a while, you really don't want to set as a precedent for elsewhere. You really don't want to, okay? But what a failure to respond is not an option. Not only because there are all these things that this will lead to, but because we have to be clear what we don't like. The great Russian memoirist Nadezhda Mandelstam said, "Happy is that country in which the despicable will at least be despised." And we need to register what our feelings about what is despicable. This was an imperialist, nativist, aggressive land grab. What can we do? I believe there are three things we need to do, and we can do quickly, or at least effectively. The first is, for much of my life, I was associated with the recovery of Baltic independence, and between 1940 and 1991, the United States maintained an official non-recognition policy. We did not recognize the forcible incorporation of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania into the USSR by Stalin when he was an ally of Hitler's. Okay? Let us be clear. We need to articulate an equally tough-minded non-recognition policy about Russian aggression and Russian seizure of territory in Ukraine. It's a political act, but it has got to have legal teeth. Non-recognition policy with respect to the Baltic countries did. Second, this tragedy could not have happened had the United States not utterly failed to understand something. And that is that the primary source of news and entertainment for Russian speakers in the non-Russian countries of the former Soviet Union is Moscow television. People define themselves by what they hear on TV. I watched in horror in August 1998 when the ruble collapsed and Russian speakers in northern Estonia thought they'd have to rush to buy things at the store because their currency would collapse, and they were paying for those goods in Estonian hard currency, the krone. But they had seen the ruble falling in Moscow, and they assumed that was true. We need to begin, and some of us are currently working on this, to begin a Russian language television network. First in the 3 Baltic countries, but hopefully more broadly, that will give the opportunity for people in these countries who speak Russian to get a news and information and entertainment service that is not controlled by what I can only describe as the increasingly fascistic tendencies in the Kremlin. And the third thing we need to do, and this is going to be real hard, we need to understand that the nature of the threat we face is not the kind of threat we were prepared to face. NATO is really good if massive forces come over a border. NATO is really useless of dealing with subversion, which is what Vladimir Putin is doing, okay? We need to think about how you fight subversion. There are good things, there's a literature on this. Read Paul W. Blackstock's works on the subject. And we're going to have to do all this I'll end, with a whole lot fewer resources than we're used to thinking we have. In 1946, the United States had 50% of the world's GDP. Today we have 20%, and in 10 years we will have 10%. It's not that we've gotten smaller, it's that other people have gotten bigger. But what you can do when you have half of the resources of the world is different than what you can do when you have 10%. In 1944, Winston Churchill said to the American ambassador to the Court of St. James, Averell Harriman, that Americans can always be counted on to do the right thing after they've tried everything else. This is usually viewed as a British view or an English view about how incompetent Americans are. But in fact, it was a deeper observation. In 1944, the United States had so many resources that we could screw up repeatedly and still get it right. Now we don't have that option. And it's important to have groups like this thinking about what we have to do. But the most important thing is to not limit yourself to focusing on Crimea or Transnistria, if you can find that on a map, and it doesn't exist, so you won't, and to think about what we have to do and to realize that it is not just about what happens in Ukraine, it's about what kind of a world we're going to live in and our children are going to live in. And what Vladimir Putin has done is to challenge the basis of international security around the world. And if it isn't stopped, and I don't mean stopped instantly, because we don't have the capacity to do it. If it isn't, we are going to have a world that I, for one, do not want to live in, because it will be far uglier than anything you can imagine. And the authors of that ugliness will not just be the people in the Kremlin. It will be people in Beijing, and it will be people elsewhere who will think that they can have a different policy in the future than they've had in the past. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Kalindra.
Thank you very much, and do appreciate for your very impressive intervention. Let me focus a bit on the other angle of that situation. I do recall very recent memory, 28th of February, early morning, very last day of our presidency of the Security Council. And we have received the instruction from the minister to request a meeting of the Security Council on the situation in Ukraine. That was the very first day when these little green people have appeared For us,
I think speak up a little bit so that they can all hear it. Yeah.
yeah, okay, sorry. So for us, actually, there was no any doubt, notwithstanding many perceptions imported from the East, who was behind these little green persons in Crimea. After the few efforts to have it, to discuss this crisis and to look for the solution, we understood that actually Security Council, unfortunately, is not capable to solve that issue. Then the like-minded countries and then the friends of Ukraine, where we had many brainstorming sessions, how we, international community, could assist Ukrainians. We were thinking about the International Court of Justice. We do have many cases, more or less similar. We do have international organizations. And then we started to draft that resolution on situation in Ukraine in order to prevent this upcoming referendum on Crimean independence, so-called Crimean independence, that's supposed to happen, that has happened on the 16th of March. When we did that, we found it not just very symbolic from a political point of view, as we got 100 votes in favor, but also we found that there are 10 more countries, despite Russia, the countries that are not taking care of Ukrainian territorial integrity, but they are not taking care of their own territorial integrity, because there were 11 countries that voted against the resolution on territorial integrity of Ukraine, against the principle inscribed in the United Nations Charter, against the principle inscribed in a number of bilateral agreements between any country in the world. Before tabling that resolution, the initial name was Situation in Ukraine. And probably some of the countries would have liked that very much, because we do have resolutions on situation in Afghanistan, situation in Syria. Was the situation in Ukraine similar to situation in Syria or Afghanistan? Of course no. So we kind of, after a brainstorming session, we decided to put that very provocative title of the resolution on territorial integrity of Ukraine. Why this resolution does matter? We do have let's be practical and recognize that right now the Crimea is brutally annexed by Russian Federation. We do have a number of international organizations, for example, such that were facing services in daily life. International Telecommunication Union. When we're supposed to call to Crimean resident, which country's code, international code, we're gonna use? Will it be Ukrainian or will it be Russian Federation? We do have International Postal Union. We do have International Maritime Organization. We do have International Civil Aviation Organization. So this resolution is bound to all international organizations. And I would say this is the biggest achievement of this resolution. About the implications to the Baltic states. That's another provocative question you have asked me to comment, but let me be brief. First of all, I would say that the mindset of our population has changed. There was some I wouldn't say sympathy, but some kind of feelings to our biggest neighbor. There was some kind of friendships from the former times. So we're a neighboring country, we're traveling, we know history, many cultural ties, etc. Since what has happened in Crimea, all that eventually positive mindset has shifted to very different one. And that reminded us 1940s. In 1940s, it was totally same as it was done in 2014 in Crimea. It was totally in the same way done in three Baltic states, where the annexation took place. So that reminded once again that indeed we have to care ourselves more about our future. That's why we started to think about the security sector improvement, more attention, more finances, etc. And also we understood that partnerships, nevertheless, we do have obligations, commitments, etc., even in a written form, not every time mean that these commitments will be thoroughly implemented. what is the Russian aim of that situation? Definitely, when this turmoil have started in eastern Ukraine, the key element and key purpose was to put the emphasis and attention from Crimea to east of Ukraine. In order, all the international community, all of us, who would think about the eastern Ukraine and forget about what has happened and what is the situation in Crimea. Did any of the frozen conflicts since 1990s was solved where Russia took part in this established frameworks? Was it 5+2 on Transnistria? Was it Geneva discussion? Is it the Geneva discussion on Georgian territories that are occupied still? Of course, no. Many of us who thought that Russia might intervene directly intervene into Ukraine. But probably also they have admitted that it's not the key purpose to take one part of Ukraine, because we do have situation in Moldova, as you just referred to, the Transnistria. The situation is that they do have one part of Moldova, this is Transnistria, while the other part, the biggest part of Moldova, goes to the west. Going to the west, you are getting more closer European Union. Would it be European Union? Would it be NATO eventually? So this is also the philosophy in our view of Russian Federation, that they will not intervene even though they could do that. So this spiral of turmoil, exporting of insurgents, militias, everything, this is the mean for them to have another buffer zone created between European Union and Russian Federation. The buffer zone, as we do have Belarus right now, the buffer zone, as we do have in some other countries around Russian Federation, to have total control on Ukraine. I do have a bit more also, just some my notes. And I would like just to touch upon one issue, famous Budapest Memorandum. What does it mean when one country, permanent member of Security Council, is not abiding with this memorandum? Does it mean that Iran right now has the power to stop all of these non-proliferation commitments? Does it mean that Middle East process participating countries that also they do have legitimate power just to stop implement what they agreed upon? So there are more questions, and definitely we have to admit that the security architecture in Europe has changed. To which extent it will develop, in which way, it's probably premature right now to say, but the situation is very complex, very different. And this is a very, very sad year, I would say, not just for Crimeans, not for Ukrainians, but for all Europeans, because the borders, what is the most dear and what is the most valuable to some extent, the borders and sovereignty actually was the right to sovereignty was denied by one of the country that is an elephant in the region. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And last but not least of our speakers, Mr. Kvelashvili from Georgia.
Thank you very much, Dr. Holland and Ivana, for organizing this event and for inviting me to speak. This issue is directly related, of course, to my country, to Georgia. As my colleague from Lithuania said, it's related not only to Georgia now, but also to a NATO member, such as Lithuania is, because it's happening in our region. And as the distinguished speaker already spoke, it's about subversion. So subversion is a big issue. But let me start by commenting a little bit on the paper itself. Of course, it's a very educational paper, and it's comprehensive in many ways. It can be used by scholars, by students, by professionals, diplomats, and so on. And of course, I paid attention to all of the parts of the paper, but especially to that one that's related to Georgia. I would think that the portion related to Georgia could have been a little bit bigger because what we see now, it's a sequel. It's something that had started earlier, and just we see the continuation of the process, not just some kind of aberration. And I discovered that, for example, this one quote that's there, declaring that Russia was exercising its right under UN Charter Article 51, self-defense, President Medvedev responded to a Georgian attack on Russian peacekeepers in South Ossetia, in Skhin Valley. Actually, that's already a Russian narrative, that as if Georgia had attacked first on Russian peacekeepers and then Medvedev responded. If it's, okay, and then we see another kind of regrettable thing here, that as a result, South Ossetia and Abkhazia, both autonomous, heavily Russian populated areas in Georgia. In fact, Russians had always been minorities there, even before the ethnic cleansing that took place, and even as we speak, ethnic Russians were a minority. And when talking about potential solutions to frozen conflicts in general, be it Transnistria or other conflicts, there are some very, very fruitful and very thoughtful recommendations. But I would think that there could have been also recommendations such as that there must be international pressure so that Russia withdraws from those territories, from the occupied territories and so on. As it concerns the recommendations vis-à-vis Ukraine, how to solve the crisis in Ukraine, one thing that comes to my mind and should be also, I think, in this document is that the Ukraine should exercise self-defense all along. Because how can you react? I mean, we are speaking about international community, how international community should react, and I mean, there was a big discussion here and elsewhere. But first of all, it's Ukrainians, right? It's, of course, Ukraine, the government of Ukraine and people of Ukraine's sovereign right for self-defense. Let me go into several other kind of more general arguments and regarding Russia's behavior before giving some parallels with Georgia. In general, I think we should pay very close attention to what Putin himself says. He is very open on many strategic dimensions of his so-called grand strategy, that is expansion of the empire. For example, I will give you 3 examples of how he himself assesses the situation. When he committed this Anschluss of Crimea, he of course organized the big, grandiose press conference, which was like a thousand of journalists attending, and there were from all over the Russia, like 8-10 time zones, this, just calling and videos, and it's not North Korea, it's a high-tech empire, right? And then you see several questions, and one of the questions was, who were those green men? I mean, my colleague mentioned green men, and most of us know those operatives who were just bad omens that appeared in Ukraine before the Anschluss, right? And Putin says, of course, that's our people. We sent them in. What do you think? Would have been just sitting around and doing nothing? So he admitted that those green men, forebringers of the Anschluss, were really, in reality, the Russian operatives. Second, he said that Crimea is there are so many myriads of examples, and I would recommend everyone listen to this 5-part, like 4-hour or 5-hour, big speech. And one that also struck, it was very important. He said that Crimea is strategically so important that it must be under strong sovereignty. So it cannot be like under weak sovereignty such as Ukraine, or we can generalize saying that Abkhazia is strategically so important it cannot be under weak Georgian sovereignty, it must be under strong Russian sovereignty, and so on and on and on. I mean, it goes on and on. I don't want to name other countries, I'm a diplomat. And the third thing happened a little bit earlier. Before organizing this big press conference, he held a joint Duma and old Russian and elite gathering together, and he addressed the Russians after the annexation and addressed officially the world. But he addressed, in his address, it was not the governments of Europe, it was the peoples of Europe. And during the press conference, there was a specific question. Of course, those questions were all staged, and that's for sure. And one of the questions, why did you address the peoples of Europe, not the governments or the states of Europe? Because he said there is no sovereignty in Europe anymore. And because of this creation of the European Union, he said sovereignty is lost. And I'm speaking to the people because people understand better me than their governments who sold their sovereignty. It's a huge issue, right? And kind of commenting on what Dr. Goble already said. I mean, it's a big political science, philosophical, or whatever questions, but it's a big threat to the security that's not in Ukraine or somewhere, but it's all international security, of course. And coming back to this document again, I mean, it's not a crisis in Ukraine, it's a Russo-Ukrainian conflict, Russo-Ukrainian crisis. I mean, we should be very open in terminology when it comes to naming things by their name. As it's also not crisis in Georgia, it's a Russo-Georgian conflict. Actually, we had Russo-Georgian war, right, in 2008. Some similarities with this, what's happening between Russia and Ukraine, what was happening and what is happening between Russia and Georgia. Actually, it goes on. I mean, it's parallel tracks going on. As we speak, barbed wires are being erected in the Russian-occupied Georgian territories, of course. Ethnic tensions, of course, it's one of the similarities, and some kind of ethnic tensions to create the grounds for the subversion and so on. Military presence on the ground, and by the way, Samantha Powers, U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, on during one of the deliberations on Ukraine that was organized, one of them by our Lithuanian colleagues as Security Council President, she compared the Ukrainian situation with the Georgian situation when military presence, whether it's a military base or whether it's peacekeeping mission, as in case of Georgia, was used as a means to achieving bigger goals. That's eventual occupation. Occupation is just method of annexation. I mean, Abkhazia and Tskhinvali, they are formally annexed to Russia, but Russian presence is there, omnipresent. So it's also technically, maybe it's not, I mean, maybe de facto, de jure it's not annexed, but de facto it's annexed. The same situation is happening there. And by the way, there is talk, as we speak, as now crisis is unfolding in one of the Georgia's occupied territories in Abkhazia. Again, there is talk of, just conducting a referendum on being incorporated into Russia or being annexed, being Anschluss and so on. But one of the biggest issues is, of course, NATO and democratic transformations of our region. EU, of course, is one of the dimensions, European Union. And Medvedev himself said, I mean, Russians made different arguments. First, they said genocide was conducted by Georgians against Ossetians. Then they said peacekeepers were attacked. Actually, it's also in the document. And then they changed again several times. And Medvedev one day came out and said that the 2008 Russian intervention was needed to stop NATO. He openly said that. I will stop here, just allow others to speak, and just thank you for listening.
Well, I think we've gotten a lot of food for thought, many interesting perspectives on the situation. And I would invite questions from the audience. Please be brief. I will restate them because we're live streaming this. But any questions from the audience for any of the speakers or points you want several to address? Yes?
It was a lot of mention of different countries, Georgia, Ukraine, Russia, even China. But why didn't you mention about Croatia, Serbia?
Croatia, Serbia. Okay. So
Actually, it was more religious stuff, but it was similar to Ukraine.
Okay, so let me just repeat the question. So many countries have been mentioned here this evening, China, Russia, Ukraine, but no mention of Serbia or Croatia. What are the parallels? Anyone want to address that?
I'll be happy to start, because I've written on this. In Dick Ullman's book, The World in Yugoslavia's Wars. I want to make, I'll make 3 points, and very quickly. First, the coming apart of Yugoslavia reflected the fact that Yugoslavia probably shouldn't have been a country to begin with in 1919. It also reflected the fact that with the death of Tito, we watched the rise of what can only be described as fascism in Serbia that led to violence against Muslims, and there was a great deal of it, and it was clearly documented, and that it led to Kosovo following under international law with respect to oppression. One of the things that's clearly different is, despite the claims of Russia today and Moscow television, there is no pattern of that kind in Crimea, in Ukraine, in Georgia, or anywhere else. What the Serbian government, we won't speak of individual Serbs, but what the Serbian government did to minorities was an act of genocide, and that's one of the bases that a self-determination can kick in. The third point I would make is that the international community has acted a number of times in ways about taking countries apart. I thought the issue that I would be talking about if I were looking at this issue is Sudan, because South Sudan is a much more complicated issue in terms of whether things qualify. I am very much in favor of the stability of borders and the lowering of the significance of ethnicity, because I know what the elevation of the ethnicity can do in Serbia and in Putin's Russia. Having said that, I believe that the international community, and that means essentially at this point, because Russia is no longer part of the comity of nations by its violation of international law, the Western view is going to be that we should be a whole lot more cautious about border changes. The United States, in fact, has been against border changes. As Jack Matlock, the former American ambassador, pointed out, the United States didn't even want the Soviet Union to come apart. It wanted Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania to be independent, but it didn't. The fact is the U.S. government, I'm not speaking for myself, I wanted it to come apart rather more than it did. But we were very clear that it was about the occupation of Estonia and Lithuania, and it was the Soviet Constitution that opened the way to the demise. And the United States, let me be this last point. On February 6, 1992, the White House declared that the United States would not recognize any secession from secession on the territory of the former Soviet Union, by which it meant it would not recognize border changes. The idea was to prevent, in Brent Scowcroft's gloss on this, a nuclear Yugoslavia. The fact, of course, is that no country of the successor states ever controlled nuclear weapons. That was a Russian lie. There were nuclear weapons on the territories of 3 of those places, but they were controlled by what passed for the Russian army. The fact is the Ukrainians were able to restrict the movement of these goods, presumably by police action, simply blocking highways or rail lines. They were never, not once, ever, despite what Vladimir Putin and Dmitry Medvedev have said, and lots of people accept it because Moscow says it, they were never able to fire these things, nor were they ever able to prevent them being fired. And that's the basis of control. And it is important to note, this is something that needs to be underlined, because the Budapest Memorandum has been mentioned. The Ukrainian government gave up, or allowed to be pulled out by the Russian military, the only nuclear weapons it could ever conceivably use against the Russian Federation, which was tactical stuff. The strategic stuff was really good if you wanted to take out Vladivostok, but other than that, it really wasn't useful in the case, even if they had control, which they did not. The Budapest Memorandum was about a lot more than it is, and I dissent strongly from the idea that this was a marginal thing, and I'm appalled by senior American officials who said, well, it really isn't an agreement, it isn't really a treaty, or really doesn't have standing. No, it has very big standing, because it was about not just Ukraine, it was about the entire settlement of 91 and the stability of that. So it's important to understand that I sympathize with the idea that if you look at Yugoslavia, how did Yugoslavia come? But it is Yugoslavia and the case of Crimea, or the case of Abkhazia and South Ossetia and Georgia, or in Transnistria, or in any of the other frozen conflicts which the Russian government has inserted itself in, are fundamentally different situations. And that the simply lumping them together, this is something that is done all the time in the efforts to be comparative, in the efforts to be, on the one hand, on the other hand. But the fact is there are differences, and this just has to be accepted. As I say, I did a rather big article on the nature of the problem in Yugoslavia in Dick Ullman's book some years back, and there are no parallels, despite the insistence of the propagandists in Moscow otherwise.
Yeah, just to address really quick, on the report we addressed the former Yugoslavia in 2 situations. The first one is about the Republika Srpska, a situation that the borders were, like they said here, the ethnicity was above the borders. They tried to seek out that region of Bosnia to reunite to Serbia, a region that you have a majority of Serbian in Bosnia, and it was not accepted by any country. It was considered illegal, and that situation remains it is a part of Bosnia until today, and they have a special status like Crimea had. That's the parallel we put in the report. And the other situation was the situation in Kosovo, where the parliament declared its independence, but you have to look before they belong to Serbia, but because of the war that they had, because there was a situation that led to their independence, not the situation before. It was impossible to pursue Kosovo as a part of Serbia after the war, the ethnic cleansing, and that's the parallel we trace with Crimea, because that situation we saw in Kosovo, we didn't see in Crimea.
Could I add just one footnote, because it's important to what's just been said? Let's be very clear here. Borders are not something that have existed forever and that were given by God. They've been created over time. The notion that Crimea is some kind eternally Russian is simply outright lie. Russia seized it in 1783. And what was true in the former Yugoslavia, although a much less extent than in the Soviet Union, is that the borders of the Soviet republics were drawn to create conflicts, not to resolve them. They were never intended to be ethnically homogeneous places. 2 points on this. The greatest state builder in the history of Ukraine was Joseph Stalin. No other official added more territory to Ukraine than Stalin, and I think he deserves a statue in Kiev for that, and there will be then a statue of Putin, who will be the greatest nation builder, who will have united Ukraine. It is just fundamentally nonsense to think these borders are true. The fact is, and I'm happy to say I've also written quite a bit about this, republic borders were changed 200 times. And that what we talk about in places like Karabakh, or Transnistria, or Crimea, were organized, the lines were drawn to create tensions. Stalin always wanted a local minority. To draw one Baltic example, when the Russian government of Boris Yeltsin was denouncing the fascistic Estonians for oppressing the ethnic Russians in the northeast at Narva, Kohtla-Järve, and Sillamäe. At one point, the Estonians just got frustrated and said, well, we have a solution. We'll just move our borders 30 miles west, okay? And you can deal with those people, all right? The greatest opposition to that idea came from the ethnic Russians in Narva, Kohtla-Järve, and Sillamäe, who had incomes 10 times to 15 times what was the case in Pskov Oblast. The next greatest opposition came from the Russian government that would lose any hope that it had leverage inside, because the percentage of ethnic Estonians under this arrangement would have gone from 68% to 84% overnight. Okay? And the third people that had the biggest problem were the government of the United States, which didn't want borders changed because we'd have to buy new maps. I mean, it was a bad scene all around. So the Estonians, of course, didn't really plan to give up their territory that way. But it is important to know that these lines were drawn to create tensions, not to resolve them. And that's true of every single place in the territory of the former Soviet Union. That's true of every border. Every single border there was drawn by Stalin, and it was drawn with an intention to create tensions between peoples. And it's why Stalin was probably the greatest ethnic engineer in the history of humanity. It's why you don't have fights until Crimea, and the Russians have really made a big mistake. The basic axis of conflict on the territory of the former Soviet Union has been among non-Russians rather than between Russians and non-Russians. And what that means is that was a way to deflect anger at the central government of the Soviet Union. But now Vladimir Putin, having violated that principle, has now guaranteed that Ukrainians will never cooperate with Russians. They will be the second Poland. And he has also guaranteed, an article in Nowa Gazeta yesterday pointed out, that he has put paid to any possibility that any nation will cooperate willingly with the Russian Federation as long as it's under a leader who suggests openly that their sovereignty and their borders are up for grabs, and he will decide, not the peoples of those countries. That's just it. There's a lot of nonsense out there about these borders.
Yes.
Sir, Putin just signed a gas deal with China. Is it fair, or should one compare or take that into content in terms of the attitudes of various Russian governments towards the Ukrainians over the past centuries? Compare that to the Chinese government's attitude towards Tibet. And I take that into the content of what you so very valiantly said. We need to maintain a sustainable focus on Ukraine in general and Crimea in particular. It's not a done deal. But how do you smooth that?
Well,
Why don't you restate the question? If
Okay,
you would.
the question is, how does all of this play into the issue of the Russian-Chinese gas deal? Well, my own personal view is that Vladimir Putin has just written the death sentence for his own country, that he cannot control Russia beyond the Urals under this agreement. This was a horrific mistake, and it's been pointed out a great deal. It is short-term thinking about his greed and trying to get even more money, but it is going to create a situation where Russia will be very much the junior partner, and Russia will lose Siberia and the Far East within, I would guess, 10 years or so. The demographics are such, the fact that ethnic Chinese already have extraterritorial status in the territory of the Russian Federation if they're operating these things, the fact that ethnic Chinese are exporting water from Siberia and the Russian Far East to China, the fact that the number of ethnic Chinese on a given day east of the Urals in the Russian Federation approaches 5 million. There are only about 500,000 who are there on a permanent basis, that is, who will be there for a majority of 12 months. That number is going to go way up. I personally think that there is a good connection. It's important for you to raise that question with Crimea. I personally think that Vladimir Putin actually thought that given what he is doing to sell out the interests of his own country with respect to China, for short-term economic gain for himself and his cronies, needed to be covered by a new wave of patriotism, Krim Nash. Well, forgive me, he's miscalculated. And it's a good thing because he's not up against the first team anywhere in Europe or here. And the agreement with China is something, the trouble with cooperating with China is twofold. First, the Chinese think long term. Americans are now down to 20 minutes. It's the third commercial. The West Europeans are still at about a week. The people in the former Soviet space, other than the Kremlin, tend to think perhaps 50 years. The Chinese are looking out several centuries. That gives you an enormous advantage. I play chess. I like to play chess, but I admit that anyone who can think 8 moves ahead is going to beat me 9 times out of 10 because I can only think 3 or 4 moves ahead. All right? The second thing is the Chinese do not plan to be the younger brother of anyone. They plan to be the elder brother. And the consequence of being the elder brother to the Russian Federation is that the Russian government has just done something which is disastrous for its own people and disastrous for the future. Just as Alexander Nevsky was able to fight the Pope and the Teutonic Knights on Lake Peipus in the 12th century to become Russia's patron saint, only by uniting with the Mongols and leading to the importation of Mongol state traditions, which is what Muscovy is founded on, which ultimately leads to the defeat of Novgorod, which was the democratic alternative within Russia. What we have got now is St. Vladimir Vladimirovich has signed a deal with the Chinese, who have, shall we say, longer range plans. And it's not that they really want anytime soon to seize large parts of Siberia. Nobody wants anything more than 200 kilometers north of the border because there's nothing there, all right? You simply don't go there. There are no roads. There's not much of anything. There are very few people. What they want is to be the dominant power in the Pacific. And the really scary thing for me is that while we were all busily watching the Anschluss of Crimea, the Chinese were engaged in all kinds of neat things in the South China Sea with Japan. And the Japanese are now thinking very seriously about building a navy, changing their constitution, and going nuclear. I've suggested that Hollywood should get ready for a remake of Tora, 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 only this time the Americans won't have a role because we don't have a fleet. Please remember that in 1965, when the Indonesian Revolution happened, 250,000 Chinese were killed in an act of genocide. The Chinese government could do absolutely nothing because it didn't have a navy worthy of the name at that point, and because there was the American 7th Fleet in between. I promise you, if there are problems with the overseas Chinese, our friends in Beijing are going to intervene, and they are going to cite Crimea as an example. This is all interconnected. One of the things that is interesting about international affairs is that everything is linked to everything else, that people do not isolate things the way we would like to in a rational universe, because the stuff is coming at you too fast. I was delighted that Putin signed this, because I think it will accelerate the process of his replacement with a Russian government that actually cares about the Russian people and brings back the democracy and freedoms which the Russian people have every right to have. But that will only happen if we replace a man who is openly contemptuous of democracy, openly contemptuous of citizenship, openly contemptuous of a non-imperial future. And I think by signing an agreement with Beijing, Vladimir Putin has brought that day a whole lot closer. One last comment, personal comment. I was diagnosed with leukemia 2.5 years ago, and as somebody who has spent his life working for the liberation of all peoples, beginning, of course, with the Russians, who did not deserve the government they had under the Soviet Union and do not deserve the government they have now, I had reluctantly concluded that I was unlikely to live long enough to see my dream of visiting a variety of additional independent countries on the territory of the Russian Empire. Vladimir Putin, thank you. You have excelled in history so that I'm going to get that chance. And for that and all that alone, and that is all there is, I am grateful to the man in the Kremlin, because there are a whole bunch of people, in the first instance, the Russian people. The Russian nation does not deserve this. And the supposed support that Vladimir Putin has is an artificial creation. Please remember that in August 1914, Nicholas II was the hero of the Russian people before the troops went into East Prussia to take the pressure off of Paris. And 3 years later, he was under arrest. His government dissolved, and the year after that, he was executed. I'm not predicting what's going to happen, but what I will tell you is that the people in this town and in Washington who have been impressed by Russian polls of enthusiasm for Vladimir Putin are deceiving themselves mightily, because this is broad, but it is about as deep as an oil slick. And we've seen that again and again in Russia, and you don't get this kind of support overnight of a kind that lasts for very long, and we need to understand that. But he has built the Ukrainian nation, and he is changing the face of Eurasia, and he will change some borders, but they won't be borders that he personally would like to change.
Thank you. Yes, question over here.
Paul, I was going to address it to you, but I think I should address it to the whole panel. The question about, you've raised that issue about the borders, and that's a fundamental issue in terms of the international order. But given the fact that Ukraine, I actually gave a speech about that in Australia once, about 3 months ago, given the fact that Ukraine didn't actually have a Bosnia situation, the fact is then that the Ukrainians essentially lived well with all the different national minorities in Ukraine. Russians and Ukrainians did get along, and Crimean Tatars and Russians and Ukrainians got along splendidly in Crimea for the last 21 years. That's the one thing Ukraine didn't have a problem with, is the ethnic issue. The second question that now may be raised is the human rights issue. Given the fact that we now have a situation where we artificially created a border disputes and artificial protection and so on, and it may not be flying as well as it was. I don't think the Crimean Tatars or the Ukrainians are all that happy about what happened in Crimea, especially with the economic situation that someone just reported. Right? And the same thing happened artificially in eastern Ukraine. And now with this element of the Chechen fighters that are approaching, isn't it possible that we're also going to be looking at one of the great human rights disasters of all time, with war criminals running around in eastern Ukraine and possibly in Crimea after they get through with eastern Ukraine, and that's something that the West, or the rest of the planet, isn't just the West,
you
Is
want to
that,
restate
is
that?
that an issue as well? I mean, the human rights violations that we're going to be starting to see soon are going to be as grave as the border questions. Sorry.
Let me just briefly restate the question for the live streaming. So if I can very briefly restate it, the gentleman points out that there really were not ethnic conflicts in Ukraine, despite enormous range of ethnicities, and yet now we may be at the beginning of seeing serious human rights violations because many of the militants and insurgents who were in eastern Ukraine and Crimea actually have war crimes records from Chechnya. Ivana.
I'll take part of that question. Yes, absolutely, and that's something we try to cover a little bit or touch a little bit on those issues in the report. The first human rights issue is basically concerned with the fact that the people of Ukraine didn't vote on the question of territorial integrity of Ukraine, and this is their constitutional right. The referendum, the Crimean referendum, which is unlawful by the domestic law, the Crimean, because Crimea was an autonomous republic within Ukraine, it had an elevated status. Didn't have such a law that would allow for the Crimeans to vote on the question of integrity. So basically, Ukrainian people were robbed of their right to vote. Then we have one of the most pressing issues. We have methadone issues in Crimea. So basically, it's a death sentence with respect to people who are methadone. As we know, Russia doesn't support policies with respect to methadone. So we know that around 300 people, they went to the mainland, and there are still quite a few people who are in Crimea and who are not receiving methadone. And then, of course, indigenous people rights. I'm not actually naming those issues in any priority, obviously, because they are very important. Each issue is very important. Crimean Tatars, they have been recognized as indigenous people of Ukraine. Ukraine recently joined the Declaration on Indigenous People, I believe last week. And obviously, they were favoring the status quo. And right now they are fearing the prosecution, and we know their houses are searched and they're stopped. There are many issues. We just met with Crimean Tatars from Medjlis, and they are bringing their concerns all the time, and they cannot travel all the time. They the Russian security services using intimidation techniques towards them. They are forced to change their citizenship, as well as all other Crimeans, basically. And as someone said, that if people come with the guns to your house and you have children, even if you don't want to change your citizenship, you probably would consider this under the gun point. So that's something that is very, very important. So we give certain recommendations in our report. Obviously, Ukraine has lots of options to bring individual human rights claims into to the European Court of Human Rights. And obviously, Ukraine can advocate on those can be an advocate with respect to those issues as a state, and domestically, those issues can be obviously addressed as well. But there are major human rights issues that still haven't been studied. The human rights issues that happened during Maidan, when snipers were used to kill people, and the country still didn't get closure with respect to those massive killings. And we know that Russia is sheltering former President Yanukovych, and his 90-day stay has expired. So I don't know if he's staying illegally in Russia now. But there are many issues, and it has to be studied on many different levels by professionals, lawyers, doctors, obviously, indigenous people specialists, and as you said, Ukraine didn't have issues with respect to ethnicity, and they peacefully coexisted. And the current election, as a matter of fact, they proved that Ukraine doesn't have any major issues, and that Russia has been misinforming the whole world and its citizens about the actual facts in Ukraine, because the right wing got less than 3% of support, and I believe Jewish candidate got more support than right wing. So it actually shows that Ukraine doesn't lean towards left or right. Ukraine is pretty much centered. Thank you.
Do you want to add anything?
I just want to add one thing. The Nuremberg trials established the principle that the people who give the orders are the people you go after in crimes against humanity and war crimes. And the man who's given the orders for what has happened is Vladimir Putin. I very much hope that I will live to see Vladimir Putin occupy the Milosevic Memorial Cell in The Hague. I believe that he is guilty of crimes against humanity. I believe that his treatment of the Crimean Tatars, and please remember that while everyone who knows anything realizes that the Crimeans are an indigenous people, the Crimean Tatars are an indigenous people, you know what Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin's reaction to us? He said, well, the Greeks were there before you were. So you don't qualify. Look, we need to be very clear, and we're not willing to because he might not like it. And our problem is that we're entering a period which I believe will be a relatively brief phony war, like the one that existed between October 1st and March 1st, 1939-1940, after the Germans seized Poland with their Soviet allies. The Germans did nothing for almost 6 months, and the consequence was that the West said, well, all the extremists, all the wild Churchill men are wrong about the Nazis. I mean, after all, Andronik Migranyan says that there was a good Hitler, before he did something. And he's resident in New York, as you may or may not know. Why, I don't understand, but I would lift his visa today. I would have lifted it a long time ago. But look, let's be very clear. It's the people who give orders. And the idea, which is, once again, the Western response when anything deals with Russia, is to find the lowest level people you can charge and act as if that's the problem. No, it isn't. And we need to be clear about this. We don't need to simply irritate the man. He's irritated enough. But what we do need to do is to stop lying to ourselves about the nature of the problem. The little green men didn't show up on their own. The people who denied Mustafa Dzhemilov the right to return to Crimea for 5 years were not some kind of sergeant or second lieutenant. These orders came from on high, and it's time to be honest about that to ourselves, even if there's not a lot we can do other than at least describe it in honest ways.
Question in the back.
Can I answer?
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. Yes, please.
Right. On the issue of human rights, which is absolutely important, and I would like to recall here tragic events in Russian history when cases of ethnic cleansing and genocide were conducted. One of them, of course, being in the 19th century, Circassian genocide. That was, by the way, recognized by Georgia as genocide 2 years ago. And, of course, deportation of Chechens, Ingush, and other non-loyals by Stalin, and deportation of Crimean Tatars and others, also including, by the way, from the Georgian territory, Georgian Muslim, and so on. So it's, of course, it's very scary, but that could be one possibility if the international community and the Ukraine itself and others, the human rights watchdogs, do not really react every single case of discrimination on the basis of ethnicity in Crimea or elsewhere in Ukraine. Because Georgia is another example. We had ethnic cleansings on several waves of ethnic cleansing from Abkhazia and Tskhynvali region, South Ossetia, and almost more than 400,000 people have been deported from those territories. So it's another way to look at it. And now I don't want to sound so tragic, so let me recall one joke from the Soviet period. It was around 80s, and of course that the period when Poland had food shortages and really, really difficult situation in terms of economic situation. Soviet Union just into Afghanistan, food shortages have started, but still not, people are not very hungry. So that's a situation, and the joke goes like this: two dogs, one Polish dog and one Soviet dog meet at the border, and they ask each other, "So how are you doing?" And Polish dog says that I'm hungry, and the Russian dog said that I have some little food, I can host you. And said, no, I at least can bark here. Right. So that's another way to look at the situation. And then, I mean, Crimea, as the whole Ukraine, have all along been freer and more democratic, even under previous government, and people could speak and could discuss any issue, not in the kitchen, but outside, right? So Crimeans are used to that. And so if someone tries to really suppress their freedom of expression and freedom of that won't go easily, in my opinion.
Thank you. Yes, question in the back?
Yeah, very early on, we addressed the issue of the possibility of gas being an issue, natural gas. I'm just confounded by how Russia can continuously threaten and hold over Ukraine's head the idea of raising the gas prices again, although they signed multiple agreements. What is the legal status of the land over which these pipelines, I believe, are owned by Ukrainian gas companies, right? So
Okay, so the question is, what is the legal status of the land in Ukraine through which Russian pipelines traverse? Question about the threats by Russia against Ukraine to continually raise the price of natural resources. Alex, do you want to start?
Right. Thank you for this question. Well, we have to look into the history because these pipelines have Soviet history. So it wasn't, it was generally a Soviet pipeline going through one huge state. And at this point, the pipelines are not Russian, they're owned by Ukraine, and that's why Ukraine charges its transit rates. And according to certain reports in Russian media, Ukraine is stealing or siphoning the gas elsewhere. Again, it's hard to evaluate whether that is correct or not. But the recent press articles are suggesting that the new president elected 1 week ago, Poroshenko, will face the next big gas dispute with Russia. And if I'm not mistaken, in the beginning of June, Russia has threatened to cut the supplies to Ukraine, and as a result, cut the supplies to the European Union. Russia has continuously tried to avoid transit through the territory of Ukraine by engaging in different projects to build pipelines around the territory of Ukraine. One of them we discussed today. But at this point, Russia maintains its control over the territory because in the next year, at least 5 years, it's hard to imagine Ukraine really raising the internal production of natural resources. And Russia has all of the machinery that it needs to press with the gas prices and react to certain events in Ukraine that are strictly political, react to them by just raising the price. That's what is being done at this point. So for the Russian side, they're more interested in destabilizing the situation and creating this frozen conflict that we're talking about, because they will have basically more mechanisms to press on and advance their political agenda.
Quick note on that. Everyone has to remember that Crimea is Ukraine and it's currently under Russian occupation. So basically something that is not in our recommendations but probably should be there, that international community should really watch with respect to private interests and public interests, how they react to the land and to the property in Crimea. And so this wouldn't, so we wouldn't have more precedents with respect to companies dealing with Russia and not Ukraine, or, and not just disregarding this status that, that currently Crimea is under occupation.
3 quick points. First, just get used to the idea the Russian government lies. It signs agreements, it says it will do one thing, and then it does something else. 2, the Russian government, which uses Gazprom, which is a quasi-state entity, it uses price increases not only to pressure the governments, but to pressure the governments into settling their debts for gas and oil by transferring ownership of the oil and gas networks on the territories of other countries. This has gone the furthest in the case of Armenia, but it is a tactic not only to direct pressure, but to force those countries to give Russian companies control of that. This hasn't happened yet. The third point is to understand that Russia's first effort to use the oil and gas weapon against non-Russian countries was in Estonia in January of 1992, where the Russian government announced that it would insist that the Estonians pay world prices and they pay in hard currency. The Estonian response was to say, if we have to pay world prices, we won't buy from you, and we have no hard currency, so we won't buy it at all. The Estonian economy collapsed by 2/3 in 4 months, and it was saved only because of Finnish oil and gas and Swedish supplied rubber bladders, because the Soviet government never allowed the non-Russians to build the farms of storage tanks that were necessary that would give them flexibility. After January of 1992, the Russian government used concessionary prices. It did not ever say world prices everywhere, because it did not want to provoke what happened with Estonia, which was a complete reorientation. Estonia went from 94% integration with the former Soviet market to about 80% integration with the West. It was a very hard thing. Helping Ukraine make that kind of radical break will be far more difficult, because we are not talking about a nation of at that point 1.5 million people as we were in Estonia. We're talking about a people of 45 to 50 million people. But what is going to happen is it's going to lead to a reorientation, and it's the question you're going to look for Lavrov to demand that Ukraine pay for its oil and gas by transferring ownership of the pipelines and the pumping stations and the petroleum processing plants, because that's the model they want. Once they own them, the rules change in terms of what they can do.
I'm going to take one last question. Yes.
You mentioned the war subversion many times, and one of the tactics of this war is to lay the blame on kind of pointing fingers and saying the starts first. So there are a lot of Putin's apologists, both of course in Russia and in some parts of Ukraine, but also in the West. And I'm sure you're probably familiar with arguments, let's say, by Stephen Cohen. I believe he's a Columbia professor and very acclaimed. And, so his main argument is that basically the West provoked Russia's reaction by advancing NATO and kind of infringing on Russia's historical borders. So I was wondering what would be your response to this?
He's wrong.
Wait. All right, you got the word. For our viewing audience, let me just restate the question, that there was a lot of discussion about subversion. There are many people who say that Russia is always accusing the West and others of Ukraine of taking the first move. And the issue is more generally put in the United States. Stephen Cohen has been an advocate to say that NATO brought this upon itself. What's the reaction? And I believe Mr. Goebel has given he's wrong.
The Nazis said that the Poles invaded Germany, and Germany responded in September of 1939. The Soviets under Stalin said the Finns invaded the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union was forced to respond. Vladimir Putin's ideologists are continuing in a great tradition of simply lying. However, let me make one qualification to this. There is an American notion, which is very foolish, that all problems have solutions. there are things in the world that don't have solutions because they're just simply part of the landscape and there's no thing. I once had a debate with the author of the rather foolish book, Getting to Yes, about negotiation, the assumption that you could always get a solution. And this debate was conducted in Russian in Moscow and back in the early 90s. And I said I could only agree with the author of this, that if he said, if you intervene early enough, you can solve all problems. And I said, yes, if someone had gotten to Eve before the snake did, there was a chance. But short of that, we're going to live with conflicts. But what the Russian government claims they were promised about NATO expansion is A, not true. It's simply not true. B, what Steve Cohen has written about that is also not true because it is based on Russian claims which are not true. If Sergei Lavrov told me the sky was blue, I would look up. I mean, with all due respect, the number of things that are said that are simply not true on this. I think there was a debate which the Americans failed to have about NATO, of the continued existence of NATO. I think there were two good options and one very bad one. The good option, the best option, was to extend NATO up to the borders of the Russian Federation, and we'd never have heard of Lukashenko, and we wouldn't have the problems with Crimea. The other option was to say NATO was created to deal with an enemy that has self-destructed, and maybe we need a new kind of security architecture. The reality is the United States, not knowing what to do and being afraid of losing its chief integument with Western Europe, which is what NATO is about, and it's why Vladimir Putin is going to try to break NATO in the Baltic countries, is without NATO, how do we interact with the Europeans? Because that's how we've done it for a long time. So we busily tried to create a new NATO, which I would remind you no one in Eastern Europe wanted to join. They wanted to join the old NATO with American bases on their eastern border and the cruise missiles heading to Moscow because they felt their security threatened. But the claims that the Americans promised they would never expand NATO are not true. They were never made. And the statements, repeated statements of those things in the American media by people who should check those sources are simply not true. Steve Cohen is someone who has done wonderful work. He wrote a brilliant biography of Bukharin. He has written a number of good things. On this issue, unfortunately, his sources aren't very good, and he should check them because it's simply, there was never a promise made by anybody who was in a position to make the promise, which is to say the President or the Secretary of State. It didn't happen.
Did anyone else on the panel want to speak to this point about subversion? Yes.
On NATO, right? Again, I would agree, of course, with Mr. Gobley on this, because it's not actually about NATO, but about borders again, and not about borders, in fact, but about margins. Because for Russia, and especially present-day Russia, it recognizes not borders, but it has some kind of margins in their understanding that could be expanded, of course, for the benefit of Russia. Why this terminology of near abroad then? Near abroad directly is linked to this issue of margins or imagination of margins. And it's not about NATO coming there, but it's about free choice and freedom that's every sovereign nation is entitled to join any alliance they want. So it's about freedom of choice. It's like individual freedom. Thank you. Okay.
I want to thank the panel. This was a terrific discussion. Thank you very much, and thank all of you for coming. And I think people will stay here to answer a few questions. So thank you very much.